Good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Colleen Bass and I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement for the West Coast with the University of Maryland Alumni Association. We are excited that you are able to join us for today's webinar, Foundations of Building Wealth, presented by Mark Jutkowitz. This webinar is part of the Alumni Association's Professional Development Webinar Series, in which we hope to provide thought-provoking and valuable content that will help alumni like you achieve your personal and professional goals. We have a lot of information to cover today, but we will take questions at the end of the webinar. Feel free to submit any questions using the question box located on the GoToWebinar control panel throughout the presentation. Mark joined the Lindenberg Wealth Management Group in 2017 after spending most of his career as a financial advisor at both CIC Wealth in Rockville, Maryland, and ING Financial Partners in Tysons, Virginia. Mark's passion for helping people reach their financial goals is what drives him to take the time to understand each client's unique situation. He specializes in helping individuals and families navigate through complex life events and transitional periods where proactive planning can make all the difference. In addition to holding securities registrations and insurance licenses, Mark is a certified financial planner, which he obtained after completing the financial planning program through Kaplan University. Prior to this, Mark earned a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Maryland, where he also played Division I lacrosse. Outside of the office, he's a defender for the Israeli national lacrosse team, competing worldwide, and takes part in the initiative to grow the sport in Israel. Off the field, you'll find Mark on the sidelines, coaching a 9th grade travel lacrosse team based in Bethesda, Maryland. And now we'll get started. Mark, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Colleen. I really appreciate it. I want to thank everybody here for taking some time out of your busy schedules to tune in. We do have the full hour. I'm going to keep my presentation to about 30 to 40 minutes, and I want to make sure I leave plenty of time for questions after. I want to make sure anyone who has any question gets it answered today on the call. You can always also reach out to me kind of one-off with an email or a phone call. Want people to know I'm happy to just be a resource. If you ever have, a question on something you see or hear, just want my opinion, that's what I'm here for. Use me as a resource. So without further ado, obviously we're here to talk about the foundations of building wealth. And in terms of, some of the topics that we're going to be going through here, we have quite a bit to get through. We're going to talk about setting goals as well as some budget tips that I have for you. We're going to talk about some types of debt, good debt and bad debt. We're going to talk about saving and why you should really be saving, as well as what it actually means in terms of pure dollars and cents for you, in terms of looking at the power of compounding interest and what that can really do to someone's account. We're also going to talk about some different asset classes in terms of what they are, as well as what the corresponding risk versus the reward you would get from investing in that asset class. We're going to go through a few of the different types of retirement accounts that you might have available to you, or that you could start on your own. They offer some great benefits, and I want to make sure everyone understands the differences between them. We're also going to then talk about some of the potential ways to look at allocating one's portfolio. Obviously, it is really case by case, but I want to give you some ideas and some points that you can go off of and start in terms of building your own portfolio. We're also going to talk about volatility, so the ups and the downs in the markets, the headline recession fears and all of that. And I want to go through and make sure everyone knows and we talk about, is this something I should really be concerned about and worried about, or is this somewhat normal par for the course? And then I'll share kind of just some ending best practices here. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we have plenty of time for questions at the end. All right, I'm actually going to kick it back to Colleen here right now for a quick poll question. Just want to kind of get a pulse for who's on the line and kind of what you may or may not be doing already.
Great. So all of our attendees now should see on their screen a poll to participate in. The question is, if you currently invest, do you own mutual funds, ETFs, individual stocks, all of the above, or what's a mutual fund or ETF? So go ahead and take a couple seconds to vote here. We'll wait for most of our attendees to have a chance to submit their answer. Get that vote in if you haven't already, and I'll go ahead and close out that poll So our responses from the audience, 37% said mutual funds, 5% said ETFs, 21% said individual stocks, 26% all of the above, and 37% what's a mutual fund or ETF.
Perfect. No, that's very helpful. Thanks, guys, for tuning in there and sharing that information with me. That is helpful in terms of, just making sure I know who I'm talking to, and I can kind of cater that, accordingly. All right. So the first step in any essential process of financial planning, or at least starting to take your own inventory and doing better with your own wealth building, is obviously to get a clear understanding of where you are today, right? It's important and it's difficult to set goals if you have no clue where you actually are starting from. So what does that really mean? That means how much after-tax income do you actually have coming in each month to your household? How much are you actually spending each month? Do you have an idea of what it takes to be able to meet your obligations each month? Do you have any debt? If so, how much? What kind of debt is it? You really want to have an idea and understanding of the interest rate, where it's held, what your payments are, and obviously understanding what type of debt it is, which we're going to talk about. Do you have an emergency fund to cover 6 months of expenses if something were to happen to you? If you can't work, if you get sick, if you lose your job? That's a good first starting goal, which we're also going to come back to. How much do you have saved? How much do you have invested, if anything, right? Where is it? What types of institutions are you working with? What is it? Is it in cash? Is it in stocks? Is it in mutual funds? It's important to just understand, again, where you're starting from, what you have. Hopefully for a lot of you, this is kind of, step one base that you've already covered. Now, the next step in terms of financial planning would really be looking at some sort of budget. I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. There are two real kind of high-level ways you can look at budgeting. One is kind of the traditional way where you track your expenses for each month. You go back and take a look, and then you set parameters for each of your spending categories from there. Now, I find that a lot of people might do that initially, but it's very difficult to stick to. It's very tedious. It makes you really think about every dollar you're spending, which is not always a great thing in terms of how to live your life. So I want to share a quick kind of trick that I have called the 60% solution. Now, it doesn't work for everybody, but it can be a nice non-traditional budgeting guide that might be a little bit more sustainable than the traditional way you might think about budgeting. So the 60% guideline, the way it works is if you think about, and 60% is a starting number, right? It's going to vary for everybody based on income, expenses, where you're living, and all of that. But if you can keep your committed expenses to about 60% of your income each month, that'll allow us to talk about automating and start to saving long term. Those committed expenses is everything from food, necessary clothing, emphasis on the necessary, right? I'm not talking about those extra Lululemon trips or Amazon purchases, household expenses, so any rent or mortgage that you pay, any bills, utilities, any insurance premiums, you obviously have to pay, car insurance, health insurance, things like that, as well as any taxes. So it's really the expenses that you have to pay each month. On the flip side, the other 40% would be what we call non-committed expenses. So we would typically break that down into roughly 10% each. Now, the retirement piece of it could be entirely going into your work retirement plan. So that could be your 401k. It could also be an IRA or a Roth IRA, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. 10% would then be in a long-term savings account, and that would typically be an actual investment account that you can really grow that money long-term. It's not for anything, within a year, I would say, but it is liquid in the sense that you can access it without having to pay a penalty to get money out early like you would with a retirement account. Then you've got your short-term savings, which really should be super liquid, easy to access to be able to transfer to a checking account, probably just a normal savings account that you keep that money cash. That would be used not only for your rainy day fund, kind of cash reserve, but also those more irregular expenses. Think about holiday gifts, vacations, things like that. Then the last 10% would be your fun money to spend. Now, the best way to actually take this and use it in practice would be if you can automate your 40% first. So on the first of the month you get paid, automatically you send your retirement contributions in. You've got a chunk going into another investment account, a chunk going into cash. And then that way, throughout the month, you would already have that 60% amount, and you pay yourself first in terms of actually getting that accomplished is one of the biggest things that I'll help talk about today is making sure you pay yourself first and making sure you automate it when you can. Just makes your life a lot easier. Now, for folks who do have, call it non-mortgage debt, so student loans, credit card debt, anything like that, you could obviously take, the retirement of the long-term savings chunk, redirect that to the higher interest rate debt in the short term to help knock that out. And then ultimately, you want to make sure you do continue to save into those longer-term buckets and not neglect them completely just for those shorter-term goals. So let's shift gears here and talk a little bit about credit. So credit, fortunately or unfortunately, is a huge part of building long-term wealth. Now, credit can be great. Credit can also be very crippling in terms of someone's financial situation. So there's really two types of credit I'm going to go through here briefly. One of which is a line of credit. Think about a credit card. The other would be a loan. So with a line of credit, you have access to a specified amount of money that you only pay whatever you borrow plus any interest that accrues. That would typically be like a credit card. On the flip side, a loan, you actually get all the money up front, but then you're on the hook to pay back everything you borrow plus any interest that accrues. So, some people probably have student loans, maybe you have a mortgage. Obviously, you got all that up front to be able to go to college or to be able to buy a house. And then vice versa, with a line of credit or a credit card, you have access to the money and you can spend it down as you need. Quick note on credit cards. Hopefully this is somewhat of a refresher to most of you. But again, it allows you to buy something now and agree to pay later. It's not free money. Credit cards really should be looked at as paying back on time every month if you can. Or if you do have to pay it over time, you do have that interest accrue. Quick example, let's take a look at the cool guy here, right? He wanted to, get that new nice green shirt he's got on. He went to the mall at the store. It cost him $70. Throughout the month, life happened. He wanted to go have dinner with his friends, pay his cell phone bill, study, and he ended up missing his payment. And so that $70 shirt will now cost him about $88, essentially, in terms of the interest accrued there. Couple of credit card, kind of do's and don'ts just briefly, and, before we shift topics here is, you do want to shop around. There's a lot of different credit cards out there that can be really helpful for various types of people in different situations. You definitely want to read the fine print. I know it can be small and tough to understand, but they can definitely slip some gotchas in there. So you want to make sure you read the agreement. Again, if you can, you want to pay your bill in full each month so you don't accrue that interest. A lot of times you can use it to track your spending, and they'll have spending categories. So thinking back to that original budget, that can be a really easy way to just take a look back at your statements or online. And sometimes they'll have some tools for you that you can see, okay, what am I spending my money on? Which is always helpful. Pay attention to any changes in your credit agreement. That can come at any time. You can get an email or a notification. Most of the time I find people just kind of brush them off. Okay, great. I really would, again, take the time to actually understand what did change, and you can always call them. They should be able to put it in plain English for you. Don't, on the flip side, spend money you can't repay, obviously. Try not to reach your maximum credit limit if you don't have to. Try not to just get a store credit card just for the discounts. I know it can be pretty enticing when you're checking out and, hey, would you like an extra 15% off? Just got to open this credit card here. That's not a good reason to open a credit card. Don't apply for more credit cards if you do carry balances on others, with one exception, which I'm going to go over here in just a second. And hopefully self-explanatory, don't give your credit card to someone else. Now, going back to not applying to more credit cards if you have balances on others, the one exception I would say is you can do what's called a balance transfer. And so there are credit cards out there that'll give you 0% interest for the first 12 months. So if you owe, 10 grand on a credit card, you could transfer that 10 grand over, not have it accrue interest for the first 12 months. Now that's really a good strategy if you actually make a plan to pay it down over those 12 months. But the catch there is that if you don't pay it down, any balance you have after is typically now going to be subject to a higher interest rate after those 12 months. So just something to consider and think about for those that do have credit card debt. One website and resource I'll give out now that I think is an awesome tool. Website called nerdwallet.com. That's N-E-R-D wallet.com. You can basically compare and search for every kind of credit card out there to find the best fit for you. So that can be, if you want the highest cash back card, highest travel rewards, best 0% interest balance transfer cards. That's a great tool that I've had clients get some really helpful advice from. All right, shifting gears here to the flip side in terms of loans. So loans are obviously larger sums of money that you would borrow for a bigger purchase, like a car, a home. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of you probably have, college or grad school student loans. Now, the biggest thing here is not to borrow more than you need, right? Because you will be on the hook for everything you borrow, as well as interest based on that higher number. So the big thing here is to understand you really do want to be careful and make sure you're only borrowing what you need. The other couple of resources I'll throw out is that if you do have credit card debt or student loan debt, oftentimes those interest rates are a lot higher, and you can actually look to potentially consolidate some of that debt and refinance it to a lower interest rate and have one lower monthly payment, which I've had some clients do, and it's been really helpful for them to be able to also save in the meantime, as opposed to all their money going towards their debt. A couple of sites that I'll mention as resources here that I've had clients use that are, they've had good experiences with. Obviously, I don't work for any of these or can't vouch completely for them, but just as resources for you to go and take a look at. One is called SoFi, S-O-F-I. Another one is called Credible. And the last one, which I think actually has some sort of partnership with the University of Maryland Alumni Association, so I would definitely check it out, is a company called Earnest, E-A-R-N-E-S-T, all of which are places that you can go and talk to somebody and put in online, here's my loan, here's what I pay, here's the interest rate, is there anything I can do better or not? And they can give you a bunch of lists of options, just something to consider in terms of helping to reduce that debt load and, helping you ultimately pay it off sooner. All right, now that everybody is nice and depressed thinking about loans and credit cards and all that, awful stuff in terms of debt, I want to shift gears here and talk about something a little bit more positive. Let's talk about saving. Let's talk about investing. Let's talk about really growing your wealth here. So saving, right? We've all heard it. We've all read it. You should. But why actually do it? Why bother? You never know what's going to come around the corner, right? You do have certain things that you can plan for, like, a kid's college education or your own retirement. But things happen, right? Maybe you want to buy a new house. Maybe you need more space. Maybe you don't, you might lose your job unexpectedly. The more you save, hopefully self-explanatory, the better off you'll be in some of those leaner times. As I mentioned, the best way to do this is to pay yourself first, and really, before you start spending money, make sure you at least contribute something on that monthly basis, whether it be into your cash reserve for that emergency fund or one of those longer-term or retirement buckets we mentioned earlier. So compounding interest is a concept of where if you have money and it's earning interest and it continues to grow on itself and snowball, it can be extremely powerful. Two quotes I just want to share briefly. I wish I could give this person credit because this is one of the most true statements I've ever read. The rich are not rich just because they earn a lot of money. The rich are rich because they save a lot of money. Now, I have a ton of clients that by no means have they ever made significant incomes in their lifetime. They've earned pretty modest incomes, frankly. But because they're diligent, they live within their means and don't overextend themselves. They save, on a monthly, annually basis, and they invest. These are clients that have never made a ton of money, but they've got, over $1 million in investments that they're going to be able to live off of. So you don't have to make a lot of money in order to become rich and build wealth. Second one here, pretty smart guy, probably heard of him, Albert Einstein. He said that compounding interest is the eighth wonder of the world. He who understands it earns it. He who does not pays it. Now, this could not be more true, and we're going to actually look at a real-life example here of what that actually means. So I know you can see obviously both here. I want you to first just try to focus here on just John. So we're going to look at two colleagues that work together. John, this is a hypothetical, just want to throw that out there. John, he was he was enjoying life, traveling, not really concerned about investing or retirement, so he got a little bit of a late start. He started investing at age 40. Let's say he put away $300 a month, or really only about $3,600 a year for the next 30 years. And let's say, hypothetically, he earned, on average, 8% a year in interest. Historically, stocks are typically somewhere between 7 to 8% annualized, but let's just say, for the example's sake, 8% here. He would have contributed $108,000 over that 30 years. At age 70, with the growth and compounding interest, he'd have an account with $450,000. That's a lot of money. right? That's pretty impressive. The fact that he can put in 108,000 and ultimately it'd be 450,000, that's pretty powerful. On the flip side, let's take a look at Amy. She was a little bit more concerned and responsible, hopefully like some of you guys on the call here. Started investing earlier at age 25. Say she invested the same $300 a year, or a month, $3,600 a year, but only for 15 years until she was 40. I would say she got the same rate of return of 8%. I want to compare apples to apples as best we can. She would have put in a total of $54,000, so half of what John put in. By the time she'd be 40, when she stops actually saving, she would already have such a head start on John because she'd have $104,500 in her account. And if she did not contribute another dollar for the next 30 years, purely just let compounding interest and time do its thing, at 70, she would have over $1 million. Now, she put in half of what John did, and she came out with more than double of what he had at the same age. The only difference being time. Same rate of return, same savings amount, albeit even less for Amy. But the fact that she had those extra years to help let this thing grow and marinate and snowball on itself is the huge difference maker that I want you to take away from this. Again, this is a hypothetical, but I want you to understand the concepts are what we're talking about, and really compounding interest and time being your biggest asset. Let's take a look at this, a step further. And let's say Amy, ideally in a perfect world, you don't have to stop at age 40 and you can continue to save. So let's say she started a little bit earlier at age 20. Maybe she had a job in college and was working hard. And maybe she was bartending at Cornerstone or something, making a bunch of money. And let's say she started investing $5,000 a year every year for 45 years, straight through her working years, up until 65. Never increased, never saved more than $5,000, just $5,000 a year, and got that same 8% rate of return. She would have invested $225,000 total, but at 65, she would have $1.93 million, just under $2 million from saving $5,000 a year. Now, again, the key here is hopefully you can end up saving more later on. Hopefully you can save for a longer period of time. Hopefully you do better than 8% in some years, others you might not. But the key is time is one of your biggest assets you have on your side. All right, so save early, right? Save often. We're living longer. Social Security may or may not be there. Personally, I think it'll be there, but maybe in a different form or fashion, but it's not something to be relied upon. As we just illustrated, compounding interest is more beneficial over time. You don't know what's going to happen. Family expenses can get expensive for those who have kids. They are not cheap, right? And we don't know what's going to happen in the future, so you do want to save early when possible. One goal I would have, give everybody out here, if you haven't already met it, is to establish a target cash reserve for that rainy day, typically anywhere between 3 to 6 months of those expenses that we talked about from the budget. Take advantage of those employer plans that you have, so the 401ks, which we're going to talk about here next. If you're eligible, which we're also going to talk about, try to max fund or max out a Roth IRA, which is $6,000 a year. That's going to be future tax-free money. Again, if you can really want to automate things, it helps make sure that you actually follow through with your plan. I found that if clients have to call me, have to hit transfer, write a check, whatever it is, life happens, life gets in the way. If you can automate it, you have a much higher percent chance of actually following through. And I was an athlete, I'm competitive. Some of you may or may not be, but one thing that some of my more, competitive clients like to do is kind of compete with themselves. Try and save each more every month, right? The only winner is going to be yourself. So just a little idea I have that you can take away and maybe put, in your own savings patterns. Shifting gears now, I want to talk a little bit about retirement accounts and why they offer such a great opportunity to save. 401k, starting on the left column. Now that is typically offered through your employer if you're lucky enough to have one. It does offer ease and convenience. It's set up directly with your payroll. Money leaves your paycheck and goes straight into this account. Sometimes if your company's generous, they'll give you a potential match on those dollars. So if you put in 3% of your income, they'll maybe match you 3%. That's free money you want to take advantage of. Usually you make pre-tax contributions, so you don't pay taxes on this money. It actually leaves your paycheck before you pay taxes. So you actually save in your today's taxes. It actually lowers your taxable income in your current year. The money then grows, what's called tax deferred, so you don't pay capital gains or interest every year, which is really when that compounding interest can take effect. However, one thing is certain, right, or two things, I guess, that death and taxes, if you ever heard, Uncle Sam is going to get his at some point, and that would be fully taxable at your ordinary income rates when you do to actually go to withdrawal. The other piece is that you have a simplified investment menu where they give you a certain options that you can choose from, which is really helpful for folks who are do-it-themselvers. And it does offer disciplined savings. So every 2 weeks, you're going to automatically be contributing to this account, whether it's markets up or down. That discipline is really, really helpful long term. Shifting gears to the traditional or rollover IRA. IRA stands for individual retirement account. So this would be something that's not offered through work, but that you would set up on your own. This is an account where you can consolidate some of those old 401ks. If you've worked at multiple employers, you can consolidate and roll them over into one account. It's taxed the same way typically as your 401k, so it's pre-tax money, grows tax deferred. Again, since it's never been taxed, it will ultimately be fully taxable when you do take money out in retirement. The biggest difference here is the difference in investment options. So with the 401k, you're very limited to what you can choose. With the traditional IRA, you have the entire investing world. You can buy, individual stocks, individual bonds, real estate, mutual funds, ETFs. So you really do have a lot more options, which can be a little bit overwhelming for some that do it on their own, but also can be really, really helpful for folks who do work with advisors who enjoy doing the research. You can build a much more customized portfolio. The Roth IRA, on the flip side, the biggest difference between a traditional IRA and a Roth IRA is the taxes and how it's taxed. So this is actually after-tax money that you put in. But once you put this money in this account, it's never going to be taxed again. So it'll grow tax deferred and actually come out tax-free. Big difference here is that there are income limits. So if you filed your taxes, on your own single, if you make more than $122,000 this year, you may not be able to actually contribute directly. You could still maintain a Roth, but you will not be able to contribute directly. Vice versa, if you're married and you file jointly, the income threshold is $193,000. For those that make more than those thresholds, you can do what are called Roth conversions. They can get a little bit complex, so I would definitely, make sure you consult professionals if you're thinking about a strategy like that. Again, you have the same wide variety of investment options as a traditional IRA. Last two things I want to talk about in terms of differences are contribution amounts. So with a 401k, you can put up to $19,000 per year as an employee into this account. That does not count for the potential match from the employer. With a traditional or a Roth IRA, you're limited to only $6,000, which I mentioned in the previous slide, per year. For those who are over 50, you get what's called a catch-up contribution, which would be an additional $1,000 with an IRA. So you could do $7,000 or an extra $6,000 with a 401k, so $25,000. Last thing is there's two ages to remember. 59 and a half. At age 59 and a half is when you can actually start taking withdrawals from your 401k or traditional IRA and not have to pay an early withdrawal 10% penalty. 70 and a half, vice versa. If you haven't taken money out, or if you have, IRS is going to come after you and say, okay, you now need to start taking, X amount out of your account every year so that you can pay taxes on it and we can get our tax revenue. Again, as I said, Uncle Sam is going to get his, whether it's, up front with a Roth or later on with a traditional or a 401k. All right, let's shift gears a little bit more towards investing here. So a couple of basic high-level asset classes I want to just review. This may be a refresher for some of you. It might be new for others. Here we have three different very high-level asset classes. So across the top, the first one is cash and short-term instruments. So this is, just general cash, checking accounts, savings accounts. This could be money markets. This could be CDs or treasury bills. It's really designed to be super, super stable and not go up and down, not fluctuate. What that means is that, you're not going to break the bank here and make a ton of money on your investment. You're going to actually have very, very low investment return potential, but at the same time, very low risk. This should be money that you should never lose on. Again, every investment here is going to have a corresponding risk and reward. So cash is obviously the lowest in potential reward, but also the lowest risk. Middle column here, we've got bonds. So buying a bond or a bond fund, you're actually loaning money to an entity. That could be University of Maryland. That could be the state of Maryland. That could be the federal government if you have U.S. bonds. That could also be to a company. You could buy Microsoft bonds where you loan Microsoft money and they're going to pay you interest. When you do lend money, typically there's interest that's paid periodically, as well as if you hold it to maturity, you would get your principal back. Now, that is not always the case. As you see here, moderate risk and moderate return. So they're not guaranteed. There is risk there. These entities could default. They might not have the money to pay you back ultimately. There's also interest rate risk. So when interest rates go up, bond prices tend to act inversely and go down. So you have a little bit of risk there. But at the same time, you can get a little bit more interest. You can make, maybe 3, 4, 5+%, on those investments. You wouldn't expect it to be, double digits per se, which sometimes it can. But again, you're going to have a little bit more reward for a little bit more risk. Far side here, stocks, you're actually buying ownership in a company. So think about buying Apple stock or Amazon stock. You actually own shares in that company, which means you participate in both the good times as well as the bad times. So stocks, you would expect to see much more fluctuation, much more of a roller coaster. But what that means for if you have long-term, a time horizon that you have a lot of years to go, you can make a lot more money on your return potential, but you also carry a lot more risk. Now, when I asked the polling question about mutual funds and ETFs, those are typically vehicles that bundle a lot of different stocks or a lot of different bonds into one investment for you. They can be really good vehicles for folks doing it on their own. Now, I'm not going to get into the very nitty-gritty of differences between mutual funds and ETFs, although happy to talk about it after. Typically, at a high level, ETFs tend to be a little bit lower cost than mutual funds and a little bit more tax efficient, but they can be less what's called active in terms of their management. So there's pros and cons to both. Both are great vehicles. You can also own individual bonds or individual stocks outright as well. Again, pros and cons to everything. I don't have time to get into the nitty-gritty here on each one, but just wanted to give you a quick high level there. So, okay, that's great, but what does it actually mean for me and my portfolio, you might be thinking? So I actually hate this slide. I hate cookie cutter recommendations, which this is not a recommendation. This is when you think about building your portfolio, you first want to start with building what's called your asset allocation. So how much should I even have in stocks or stock mutual funds? How much should I have in bonds, and how much should I carry in cash? From there, once you build your allocation, is then when you fill in the sleeves of, okay, within stocks, I want to own, these individual stocks or these funds or these certain types of bonds. But again, you want to start high level. Now, for younger folks who tend to have a longer term horizon, they might be comfortable taking more risk and being aggressive. I would call this a moderate growth oriented portfolio. So it's not the most aggressive, but it is, long-term growth as the objective by having 75% in equities or stocks, 15% in bonds, and 10% in cash. You see the majority is green. Stocks, as we just talked about, that's going to carry the highest risk versus reward. Bonds, again, are going to have a little bit more moderate risk and return, and cash the lowest. Personally, for myself, I work in the industry, so I'm comfortable and I understand what we do, and I believe in having a disciplined investment approach. So, personally, I'm a little bit heavier towards the equity and stocks. But again, I hate this as a cookie cutter because I have certain clients that are very young, but they're super conservative, or maybe they're saving for a down payment on a house that's only going to be coming in the next year or two. They should be really much more conservative than this because they don't want to lose out in the short term. Vice versa, I have some clients that are much older, that are retired, and they're super aggressive. They're comfortable owning the equities. The whole takeaway here is that there is no one-size-fits-all asset allocation for everybody. It really depends on how long you have until your goal, what your comfort level of seeing, okay, if my portfolio drops, am I going to freak out? Am I going to want to sell everything and go to cash? Or am I going to look at that as an opportunity where I can buy some of my favorite investments on sale? You also want to, take into account, am I going to need to take money out of this account for a shorter term goal? So kind of your liquidity needs and what you might need from the account, as well as just your general overall situation. So there are a lot of factors that go into building an asset allocation. This is where I think, working with a professional does add some value for you in terms of helping figure out what's the right mix of assets for yourself. There are also some great online tools and quizzes you can take to help give you an idea of it, but this is really where you should start in terms of building your portfolio as opposed to starting with the actual investments. I would say it's best to start with your allocation first, then filling in the sleeves. There's an old adage I'll share as well. I disagree with it, that you should hold your age in bonds. So, for someone who's 30 years old, holding 30% in bonds and 70% in stocks. Again, I hate that because it really is not that simple. There's a lot of factors, but I will share it. Just, you may have heard that or read that somewhere. All right. So last December, if any of you guys paid attention to any of the stock market news, there was a big correction or drop in the market, as there's been some periodic ones throughout this year. And you might hear headlines of stock market is super volatile, it's up and down, you can't trust it, there's going to be a recession on the horizon. I want to actually take a look at the facts of what this might mean and what these declines actually mean and how often they actually happen. So if we take a look here, a routine decline in the market would be about 5% or more. That actually happens, shockingly enough, about 3 times a year. So that could average, that could last about a month and a half, and it happened in December, and that's normal. Moderate corrections, so drops of 10% or more, actually happen about once a year, which might surprise some people. And that could last up to a third of the year. You might be down 10% or more for a third of the year, and that's normal. Same thing with the severe and the bear market, so 15% drops or even 20% drops, frankly, happen more often than you might think, about once every 4 years. The big bear markets tend to happen about once every 7 years, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen like clockwork every 7 years by any means. They can also last, 3/4 of a year up to a year. And frankly, all of these happened actually back in December of last year. Now, the next 2 slides I want to show you is what happens after that. But I want you to understand markets don't go straight up, unfortunately, right? We all wish that they did. No one has a crystal ball in terms of timing. Markets do tend to be efficient over the long term, but these things are going to happen. They are going to pull back. They are not going to go straight up. And it's important to not lose your emotions and lose your cool about it every time it does and freak out and make drastic, rash decisions, emotional decisions. Really, you want to be as emotionless as possible and understand this is par for the course. This is what investing in stocks or the stock market is going to do. It's what's going to happen on a regular basis. But over the long term, it's where you can still make a fair amount of money. I love this chart here. Let me walk you through it. So this looks at the S&P 500, which is the 500 largest companies in the U.S., so a good representation of the U.S. stock market. Each bar is a year going back from 1980 up until today, and each number up here is the actual return that the S&P 500 would have given you if you held it from January 1st to December 31st. What these numbers on the bottom of the chart represent is the lowest point throughout that year of where you were. So intra-year declines versus what you actually would have gotten for the calendar year. Take a look at the first year, 1980. If you invested in the stock market for the 1 year, you would have made 26%. That's obviously a great rate of return. That's making more than a quarter of your money back in interest. Throughout the year, though, there's some volatility. It was down at one point 17%. So if you were a nervous investor and you sold when things were down and you didn't let that thing recover, you would have lost 17%. I want you to take a look at some of these numbers, and this is normal. These declines happen almost every single year, you can see. But if you take a look at the actual return numbers, if you hold on through those tougher times, you can end up making a lot of money. Now, here I'll highlight, we've had annual positive returns, 29 of the 39 years. And if you look at the negative years, a lot of them aren't that bad necessarily, -10, -7, -2. Obviously, you see here in the dot-com bubble burst, that was 3 terrible years of returns in a row. It's the only time that has happened since then. As well as 2008 was obviously an awful year in the markets. But if you look at the bounce back here, the very next year, 23%, 13, market was flat. The key here is to understand volatility is normal. It is going to happen. It is not something where you should lose your cool and totally change your investment discipline or strategy based on some of the short-term fluctuations. Lastly here, got a chart of that same index, the S&P 500, all the way from 1900 till today. And I want you to notice a couple of things, right? It has some of these events on here, historical events that some people thought were kind of, horrible events we would never recover from. Think about the Great Depression down here, right? We've got the global financial crisis in 2008, the dot-com bust. The whole point here is to show you over the long term, again, it doesn't go straight up by any means, as we talked about, but the overall trend is positive over a long period of time if you give things time to recover and time to develop. So even in 2008, when people thought it was the end of the world, if you take a look at this whole graph, it's really just a little blip on the radar. Obviously, that's a big decline, and no one wants to see that happen, of course. But if you held on, not only did you make your money back a few years later, but you've since doubled and almost tripled your money. The key here is to not let emotions dictate your financial and investment decisions and to really try to be disciplined and stick to your strategy. The worst thing someone can do is when everything is down is to sell and go to cash. And that's unfortunately what a lot of people did in 2008. They were nervous. They saw it going down, going down, going down. They thought it would go to zero, so they pulled their money out. The problem is they didn't get back in, and so they missed that entire bounce back and recovery, and some people are still in cash today. So that's where it's important to think about your own situation, your own time frame. If it's you're saving for a down payment in the next 2-3 years, yes, you can't afford a drop like that, so you should be in more cash or bonds. But if you're saving for retirement, that might be 20, 30 plus years away. Look at, from 1980 to 2010, that's a big increase, right? So you do want to really stay the course and try and take emotion out of it is what I'm trying to get across to everybody here. So we're kind of wrapping up here now. I said I would be about 30 to 40 minutes, kind of right in that parameter here. Couple takeaway best practices before we jump into some questions. Have a budget or at least some sort of idea of what you're spending, as well as some sort of plan. Okay, I want to save X amount. I want to try to max out my 401k this year, or at least max out, what we're getting in the match. You do want to try to establish that emergency cash reserve. We talked about a goal of anywhere from 3 to 6 months of your expenses. Try to limit number of credit cards, and if you can, make sure you pay off that bill each month to avoid accruing interest. Make those payments on time. Again, same thing there. Only borrow what you can afford to in terms of loans. Take advantage of the employer-sponsored retirement plans like 401ks. If you work for the government, it's called the TSP or Thrift Savings Plan. 403Bs if you're a teacher, work in a hospital, all very similar. Take advantage of them. They're really easy to use. They're really helpful and oftentimes low cost, and you can get a nice match. So I definitely encourage you taking a look there. And ultimately, make level-headed financial decisions, right? Don't lose your cool when things get crazy. Try not to sell into cash when things are down. You really want to try and take that emotion out of it. So with all that being said, I want to open it up to questions here and make sure we get everything addressed. But that's all I have in terms of kind of the formal programming here. Again, want to thank everybody for their time here and tuning in. And hopefully you found something valuable here and you found something you can at least go take away and implement with your own financial life. Again, I'm going to kick it back to Colleen now to go through some questions.
Great. Thank you, Mark. We will go ahead and take some time for questions now. So as a reminder, if you do have questions, go ahead and type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. And our first question here is from a recent graduate. What would be the very first step you would recommend someone take who is earning a steady salary for the first time and is trying to just get started with all of this?
Great question. First two things I would say, first and foremost, you want to get that cash reserve set up and you want to try and get at least 3 months of your expenses, because you never know what's going to happen. You don't know, a car might break down, things like that. So first and foremost, I would save into cash and just focus on saving. Once you get to a number that you feel comfortable with in your cash reserve or that rainy day fund, that's when I would definitely encourage you to start taking advantage of your 401k through work if you have one, and try to max it out in terms of the match. So if they're going to put in 5%, if you put in 5%, try and set that bar at 5% to start so you get all the free money you can. From there, you see how that affects your actual take-home pay, and then you could increase it from there. But I would say first and foremost, you want to get that cash reserve taken care of. Then above and beyond that, you could start with your employer plan. And from there, you could also open up a longer-term, investment account on your own. But that would really be after you're getting the full match and you already have your cash reserve. But that's a really great question.
Perfect. Thank you. Our next question is, what is the most common mistake you see with folks who are beginning to explore investing for the first time?
That's a good question. And that's actually what I kind of just touched on. The biggest mistake I see is letting emotions get in the way. And that could be both on the up and the downside. So if things are really good, putting all their eggs in one basket. One example, a few years ago, Amazon, the stock was on, an absolute tear. It was on fire. It was growing like crazy. A lot of people out there took money from other investments and said, this is the best investment. I'm going to put all my money in Amazon. Since then, it's really pulled back, and it really hasn't done a ton in the past year and a half. On the flip side, not getting emotional on the downside, if things are dropping, if things are, correcting, as we talked about, down 5%, 10%, to not get emotional and pull your money out, because then you're going to miss the bounce back and the rebound, which does tend to happen. So my biggest thing would be stick to your strategy, stick to your asset allocation as opposed to trying to pick the next hot topic or the next hot sector. We saw this with Bitcoin and some of the other digital currencies a few years ago. Again, people were selling really good investments and putting it all into Bitcoin, which most of us probably know has since crashed significantly. It was at 20,000 plus. Now it's worth about 7,000. So really taking the emotion out of it and not panicking when things are bad, but also not getting greedy and trying to put all your eggs in one basket when things are good. So really keeping a plan, staying disciplined, and not getting emotional, which is tough to do. I mean, it happens with myself in my own investments. I find myself getting emotionally attached to a stock or something like that. And I have to consistently remind myself, it's just an investment. You have to take the emotion out of it, look at the numbers, look at the fundamentals, and try your best to keep emotion out of it.
Great, thank you. Our next question here is, what are the retirement accounts where no one can recoup money from you called? Are they IRAs or a different account?
So I think this person, he or she, is talking about where if you owe debts and you file bankruptcy, or creditors, are breathing down your neck. So that's actually going to be most retirement accounts. They're going to be creditor protected because of that long-term time horizon. So at a high level, and if you want to reach out one-on-one, I can kind of walk through more specifics, but at a high level, most of those retirement accounts will be creditor protected. If you have just a taxable investment account that you can save into and pull money out of, that more likely than not will not be protected. The other way, I might be looking at this question is, I don't know if you're asking about protected in the sense of when someone passes away to your heirs. So that would be using what's called trusts. So trust assets bypass what's called probate. That could be what you're asking for. Not quite sure based on the question, but it could be either using trust accounts and or trusts to protect assets, or typically retirement accounts are creditor protected.
Great, thank you. And as a reminder for folks who do have these more specific questions that we might not be able to answer completely during the presentation, we'll be sharing this recording as well as Mark's contact information so you all can work together individually. A couple more questions here. This one says, I have two young 529s and would like to know how that would fit into the 40% savings plan.
Absolutely. That's a great question. I didn't have enough time to really get into college and education savings, but 529 accounts are awesome vehicles. That would fit into the 40% in that longer term. So not retirement savings, but long-term savings for a future goal. So the four that I broke down were retirement savings, long-term, short-term, and fun money. So the fun money is just money you're going to spend, going out, dinner, the movies, whatever. The short-term bucket is really your pure cash reserve, and that should just be in checking and savings. The 529 accounts or anything allocated for education would be that third long-term bucket that's not in a retirement account. So you could save, I think the 529s are frankly the best place to save for that goal. There are some nuances and caveats in terms of making sure you want to avoid certain things and how you allocate it. But that would fit in that third rung of the long-term savings. And that's, definitely when we look at building a financial plan, how do we balance that? How much should we actually be putting towards college? How much should we be putting towards, cash reserve, how much towards retirement. So the 60-40 is a good starting point, but, it really does vary based on your own circumstances. How long until you have those kids going to college? How much are you able to actually fund? So those are really good questions, but in terms of your actual, the short answer is it would be that long-term savings bucket. Great question, though.
Thank you. Our next question here is it better to max out the 401k or the IRA?
Now, that's a great question. My initial thought is, one, it depends on your situation, but two, I would start with the 401k for a few reasons. One of which, it's a higher limit, so you can put $19,000 into it as opposed to only $6,000 in the IRA, which is really going to help you in your taxes in the current year. The other piece of it is if you get the match in there, you obviously want to take advantage of that. It's also a little bit easier. Now, if we're talking about a Roth IRA, that could be a little bit different. I would say definitely take advantage of the match if you have one in your 401k, and then maybe above and beyond that, instead of maxing out the rest of it to $19,000, maybe put your 5% in or whatever it is to get the free money, and then you could save above and beyond that into a Roth IRA, because that's never going to get taxed again. But it really depends on your own tax situation. If you find that you're really tight in taxes in each current year and you're getting crushed in taxes, I would say you're going to be better off maxing out the 401k, because that's really going to help reduce it more, your current taxable income. If you find that you got left over, you get a pretty nice refund every year and you've got some extra money, again, definitely take advantage of the match first, but then look at a Roth IRA. There are some caveats with traditional IRAs that you may or may not be able to actually deduct your contributions depending on your income situation. So that would be a one-off question that I'm happy to kind of walk through with somebody. But at a high level, I would say start with the 401k and or at least up to the match. And then if you're eligible, look at the Roth IRA or maxing out the 401k first. But that's a really good question.
Great. For our last couple questions here, I'm going to group them together because they're similar topics. So these next two, if your goal is to save for a home rather than retirement, how does that change an investment and saving strategy? And compared to buying a house, what advantage does buying stocks have? Is this a good period? Is this period a good time to buy a house or stocks? Which one would you recommend now?
Okay, great questions. Let me first address that first question of how does that change your investments or your allocation if you're saving for a down payment or for a house within the short term. So if you're saving for a goal that's really 3 to 5 years or less, I don't recommend you buying stocks because you can't control the timing of it, which kind of ties into my next point. Unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball. If I did, I probably wouldn't be at my desk. I'd probably be on a beach somewhere if I knew exactly when to buy stocks and when to sell them. Unfortunately, if somebody claims they know exactly when to do that perfectly, I would run the other way. But really, I would say if you have that short-term goal, don't completely put off retirement. Maybe lower your contributions, but still have something going into that retirement bucket, but have more of it going into that shorter-term or longer-term bucket, where it is liquid, which you can access it. And you could look at like a money market fund, which today you can get close to 1.5%, 2% potentially. It's not, incredible game-changing interest, but, it's going to be more than inflation. You're going to get some compensation there. But you really want to save into a much less riskier bucket for that short-term goal. When I then parlaying into the second question, when I think about buying real estate versus buying stocks, there's no right or wrong answer here. There's just differences. So the couple of the big differences to think about is, real estate or a house is not liquid. If you need that money right away, it's not like you can go to your house and say, hey, house, I need $5,000, pay me, right? It's illiquid. You would have to, sell the house, find a realtor, if not, sell it yourself, go through that process, pay commissions to actually liquidate it and use funds from it. You could also do what's called the cash out refinance. I'm not going to get into that just yet, but it's less liquid than stocks. Stocks, if you need the money and it's not in a retirement account, you can sell it, have the money within 3 days to actually use for anything else. So it's more liquid. The other piece is if you think about historical appreciation of housing and real estate, maybe a good annual appreciation is 3% if you're not in a super, super high growth area. Stocks on average have returned about 7 or 8%. So typically over the longer term, you can actually make a lot more interest and make a lot more money with stocks. Granted, it does carry, more risk and more up and down and fluctuations. Your house is also a real asset you can see, touch, and feel. So if things do completely hit the fan, you have a hard, real asset to work with. Those are the biggest differences. I caution people at looking at residential real estate as pure investments. I also counsel my clients, look at it as a home, right? You need to live somewhere. Pick somewhere you want to live that you can afford, that you can make your own and make your home, and whether it's raise a family or just live your life there. But it would be classified, in my opinion, as more of what's called a personal use asset, where you're actually buying it to use it as opposed to a pure investment, which is more what I would classify stocks as. So yes, you can get appreciation, and a house can be a great investment. You also don't throw money away with rent. You build equity in that. You also get a little bit of a tax deduction for the interest you pay on your mortgage. But again, I wouldn't look at it as a pure investment. I would look at it, okay, this is a house we want to live in. Yes, it's in an area where we think we might be able to get appreciation, but we're not counting on that return in the well-being of our future, retirement or our sending our kids to college. Stocks or mutual funds or, more traditional investments like we talked about, like bonds, that should be looked at as more of a pure investment. And it's something you can access in the shorter term. It's something that you would expect to grow at a faster rate than maybe residential real estate. But you're looking at that as using those dollars for something in the future, as opposed to a house. You may or may not end up selling it. You might live there through retirement. You never know. So my thought is they're thinking of them as more of a personal use asset versus an investment, as well as really understanding the liquidity and what your actual return expectations are. Now, if you think you're buying in a really hot area and you're getting a really good deal, yes, you can appreciate faster than that. Now, how often that actually happens, I would question. There's also risk there, right? In 2007, 2008, the housing bubble burst. A lot of people's home values lost a ton of value, and some still haven't recovered. So houses are not riskless assets. They still do carry risk, albeit you at least have, a personal hard asset you can see and feel and live in and take advantage of. So those are the two biggest differences, I would say, between the two. But I would also talk to somebody to figure out, okay, can I even afford it? Does it make sense to use this money on a down payment versus buying stocks? And where are you in your career and situation with a family? So there's a lot that goes into it, but that's my kind of shorter, high-level answer there. Sorry for being a little bit long-winded.
Great, thank you. And we have just a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to take these last two questions together again. Can you explain the logistics of saving and investing a bit? Like, how do you open an IRA and invest money in stocks? Where do you go? Is it a type of bank account that you open up? And then also, if you are just starting out investing, is it best to start off working with a financial advisor?
Very good questions. So if you were to want to start, whether it be a retirement account or just a account you can buy stocks in, it's separate from a bank account. You can go, there's a lot of, most institutions will offer it. If it's not a retirement account, it's probably called just an individual account or just a taxable brokerage account. You could do that at, everywhere from Vanguard, E-Trade, Charles Schwab, Fidelity, Wells Fargo. I mean, really any of those places have those types of accounts. What I would be careful of is how much, if you're doing it yourself and not working with an advisor, how much you're going to pay in commissions or trades. I would look for the low-cost trade providers. So that's typically around $5 or $6 per trade you would pay if you're doing it yourself. But you can obviously also work with an advisor like myself or any other advisor out there. So we open our accounts for clients, so we can do it over the phone. A lot of institutions, you can either do it online or over the phone. And then in terms of how you actually get money into it, you can either write a check, you can set up an electronic transfer where it's a secure line between your investment account and your bank account so that you can send money and they can send you money back and forth, which is typically what we do with our clients. We try to make it as easy as possible for them to save into it, as well as when they need money, not having to sign paperwork, but we can just send it directly to their bank account securely. So, look for those ways to automate it and do things electronically. I think is much better. It's frankly safer and cleaner in this day and age. In terms of when it makes sense to work with a financial advisor, if you're just starting off, My typical response would be it probably doesn't make sense to pay the fees of a financial advisor. You're not going to necessarily get the value for it. I would recommend going to a low cost place like a Charles Schwab or a Fidelity or somewhere like that, opening your own account, focus on saving. And I would start out with really a very basic, S&P 500 index fund. It's going to be super cheap. It's going to be super efficient. You're going to get the overall performance of the stock market, but really focus more on saving. As you start to make more money, as you start to be able to save more money, that's when, I personally would add value, and or, any other advisor, we would add value in our advice and the actual management of the money. I tell folks I don't ever want to charge someone a fee if I'm not going to be worth it in the advice and the value that I provide. So I talk to folks all the time that are in a similar situation, and I direct them, elsewhere. Wells Fargo does have its own kind of self-directed brokerage platform called Wells Trade. I think it's $5.95 a trade. I might have them start there on their own, and then once they save and start accumulating and get maybe 20,000 or 50,000 plus, that's really when I would say an advisor would probably add value in terms of working with them and managing it. That being said, you should always be able to talk to an advisor. Not everyone, but the way I operate and a lot do is you should be able to at least have a conversation free of charge. And that's something that I offer everyone here is just, if you want to just bounce ideas off me, I'm happy to just be a resource, point you in the right direction, whether or not it's with me or another advisor or someone you've already met or talked to. But, I would caution folks for paying extra fees and paying hourly fees or management fees if you really don't have a lot to work with. It's going to be, it might be somewhat cookie cutter. You're going to have, drag on your performance with the fee. So I only like to work with folks when I'm really going to actually be valuable for them. So you might want to start on your own at one of those low cost providers, focus on saving, focus on growing. And then ultimately, once you start to hit certain goals, you have your cash reserve taken care of, you've got, you're maxing out your retirement plan. That's when typically, working with a financial advisor would really be helpful and beneficial. Again, that being said, if you're unclear on where you are in that threshold, happy to just be a resource and help point you in the right direction, whatever that might be.
Great, thank you. So that is all the time that we have today. There were a few folks that had questions we weren't able to get to. So again, we'll be sharing Mark's contact information so you can reach out individually. Mark, is there anything else you'd like to share before we wrap up?
I think really the biggest two takeaways are it's never too late to start. The sooner you start, the more you're able to start taking advantage of compounding interest, and, try to take the emotion out of it. Don't get afraid. Don't get flustered by the short-term day-to-day headlines. There are a lot of them. There's a lot of, noise out there, but really try and stick to your plan and stay disciplined. And when it does make sense, consult professionals that are, that's what they do for a living, and, use people like myself, whether it's me or anyone else, as a resource, right? You should have access to good objective information and really stay the course.
Great. Well, thanks again, Mark, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Look out for a follow-up email with a recording of the presentation and Mark's contact information. Otherwise, have a wonderful day and go Terps.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Colleen. Thanks everyone for sticking around. Really appreciate you taking the time today.